Welcome to this edition of our Market Chats, where we discuss critical considerations for safeguarding your wealth. The world is facing increasing political instability and risks that can impact wealth. In this context, it is crucial to have a sound understanding of how to hold wealth, international structuring for asset protection, succession, and cross-border tax. This is precisely the focus of our following discussion with Brent Cowley from Overseas Trust and Pension. Rex has over 30 years of experience in the wealth management industry and is recognized for his pioneer work in international pensions. Also, he has been independently recognized in the top 100 most influential people in his sector in 2018 and 2019. In this conversation, we touch upon key trends such as protection, preservation, and succession. We also highlight the pros and cons of different options for holding wealth, including corporate, trusts, foundations, and retirement funds. We hope you find the following conversation informative.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today. I'm joined by Brent Cowley from Overseas Trust and Pension. For those who do not know Levantine & Co., we are a wealth manager helping our clients secure their long-term financial aspirations. And we work with clients pretty much across the world. And we do this, we do a lot of work with OTAP. And at that point, I'd like to give a small introduction of Rex. Rex has over 33 years in wealth space. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, 2018, 2019 was in the top 100 most influential people in global finance. Is that correct?
A very, very kind accolade. Whether it's befitting or not, I don't know, but very kind.
Maybe you'd like to add a little bit more onto my introduction and explain a little bit about yourself.
Certainly. I think at the end of the day, Attila, my career has been really been all about protection and preservation of wealth. I have this fundamental belief that everyone has the right to protect the wealth that they create. And as a result of that, my career has very much been around that, which I suppose the pinnacle point was the formation of Overseas Trust and Pension 10 years ago, with the sole purpose of that. It's asset protection, asset preservation, and ensuring as you say, the long-term outcomes for clients are achieved. So that's what we've sort of set out to do. We've got about 6,000 customers. $2.5 billion of assets have been entrusted to us to administer. I must point out there's a difference between us and yourselves. We create the structures that hold the investments, and of course you manage the investments and advise on those structures. Yeah. So I think that's how we sort of fit into the puzzle. So we're a part of a bigger solution.
So maybe that's a good point to actually get cracking with a couple of our slides. Like we mentioned, the primary role when you work with Levantine is big part of our discussion will be our investment process. And this is a big part of reaching, of course, like we said, you're securing your long-term aspirations, financial aspirations. And this is typically the context what we would talk about when we structure the portfolio. But today, importantly, is not about what's in the portfolio, but how we protect and preserve your wealth, how it's structured. And without further ado, for this conversation, I'll pass back to Rex.
Thanks. To our viewers, one of the things that Attila asked me to talk a little bit about was protection and preservation, and I think they are quite misunderstood concepts. So we'll go into that on the next slide. I think what's also important is to sort of frame things as what's actually important to clients. What is it that we see that really matters to customers? And yes, investment returns are important, but it's the outcomes that seem to be far more critical to customers. So for example, on this slide, you have the top 3 outcomes that clients typically look for. There are a greater number of outcomes, but these have been identified as the top 3 through quite a number of academic studies over the years. And the first one being absolute financial security or financial freedom, as it's also referred to, and that's being in the position where you do not have to rely on employment or any enterprise which you might have created to support yourself financially going forward. So you can live the life that you want to live, and whatever that might mean to you, without the concerns of employment or indeed enterprise that you might have created. So you have sufficient wealth to live out the life that you want, and that's probably an aspiration that most of us are working towards. Some of us have already got there. The other key one is helping the children to become independent, and that's not the kids becoming financially independent. That's ensuring that the kids can stand on their own 2 feet. They've got their education, they've got their careers, and effectively they're no longer a financial burden on you. I think in today's age, we all know how expensive university education can be, and everyone's going on to do their postgrads and masters these days. It's become pretty much a requirement. So the cost to education children is high, as is assisting them to set up their own businesses, etc. So getting the kids to that point is important. And of course, the other critical point here is when you do pass away, what happens to your wealth? I think this is a very critical point. None of us know when we're going to pass away, typically don't. And when you do pass, does it go to the right people? Does it go efficiently? Does it get, what are the costs associated with passing on that wealth? What are the taxes and the rules that might apply to your wealth, particularly where you have wealth held in different territories? A very, very complex area. We will touch on this briefly. But I think the point to take from this slide is that there are objectives that we're working to. Some of you on the line might be closer to those objectives as others. You might have achieved 1 or 2 of these. However, our life is a journey. And as we go along that journey, there are threats and risks that are ever present. And if one of these threats manifests themselves and it's a catastrophe risk, it could wipe out your wealth. So as you build wealth, in order to fulfill those objectives that you have, it becomes critical to protect that wealth and preserve that wealth from a myriad of risks. And I think we're going to look at some of those risks now. And I know, Attila, you'll be able to put this into a bit more context for us from a Turkish perspective. But yes, so in order to achieve these objectives, you have to accumulate wealth. And if you're going to accumulate wealth, you have to protect it, because if you lose your wealth, a catastrophe event happens, bankruptcy, some kind of disaster happens. For most of us, we won't have the time, the opportunity, or the energy to recreate it. And this is why protection of wealth is really, really important, and preservation. But I tell you, if we could pop onto the next slide, where I can try and define the difference between protection and preservation. So I think, as the slide says here, protection is really about catastrophe events. These are things that the likelihood of them happening is incredibly rare, but if they do happen, they are devastating to your wealth. These can be economic, political, social, environmental factors that could come to play. But as I said, they are devastating. So putting in place legal structures to protect from those catastrophe events becomes really, really important. And we will look at some of those structures a little bit later on. Preservation of wealth is slightly different to protection, in that preservation focuses on mitigating or dampening down some of the sustained erosive threats that wealth faces. Example, inflation is a sustained risk. Taxation is a sustained erosive effect on wealth if it's not structured properly. And you have others, costs. The costs of the services you use erode your wealth. And of course, other things that, such as the long-term underperformance of the investments that you have, also undermines and slowly erodes your wealth. So those are the kind of things that you're going to think. So if I can ask you in terms of the discussion today, think about, at the end of the day, there's some outcomes that you want to achieve. There's a path that we all go along, and along that path, we have two sets of risks that can impact on our ability to meet those objectives, both catastrophic risk and continued sustained erosive risks. Attila, I don't know if you can put some of that into context for people.
Yeah, so I wanted to, you mentioned how rare they happen, but if you put a lot of low probability events together, there's a high probability something will happen. So this is literally off the top of my head, and this is not even risks that can happen at a personal level. These are just, while putting these slides together, this is some of the events that are global and Turkey specific that I came up with over just over 20 years. And these all have significant financial risk, let's say, to individuals. Our catastrophe risk could be catastrophe risk. And you can see they're not so infrequent. They may be country specific, they may be just event specific, but these things do happen. Now, like I said, this isn't individual risks. This is more global macro type of risks that can happen. But something I think we have to put in context is, yes, markets recover, etc. But also, it's about the timing. When things go wrong, and it's just bad timing. And so, if you're invested during the dot-com bubble and you need to exit, etc. So there is a big factor of timing when you look at preservation, and these things aren't as irregular as one would hope. So as we go on from here, I'll just go to the next slide.
Yeah, so if I can just pick up on that, I think, as we've both been in the industry for donkey's years, and I remember,
thank you, Rex.
when we've been in the when we were sort of in the the period of time when we had sort of the great financial crisis, as you've called it. At that time, we had a lot of clients who held assets in their personal names with AAA credit rated banks. I'm referring to the Icelandic banks. Triple rated. Those banks failed. Those clients lost all of their money. Yeah, there were some of the international branches that were based in places like the Isle of Man, where people got a part of their funds returned. But where it was based in Iceland, they lost their money, and that was billions. I mean, this exposure to those Atlantic banks was significant. And of course, we had Lehman's in the States. And right now we're seeing two banks in the States in incredibly difficult situations. And the big question is that the tip of the iceberg? What about the rest of the banks? We only have to look at Switzerland to see the mess there. So I
don't forget Cyprus in 2008.
Yes, 2013 was Cyprus, and there was another point.
2013.
2013, yes. So, Cyprus, part of the EU, a developed nation. You went to bed with money in the bank. Say you had $500,000 in the bank in Cyprus. The next morning, when you woke up, the government had nationalized everything over 100,000. So we have, and that was gone. There was a petition to the European Court of Justice on the back of that. The petition failed. Why? Because every country has the right to impose the laws of its country on its citizens or assets within its borders. So I think those kind of things. But then what we've seen is the spillover from COVID, the amount of bankruptcy that we saw. And bankruptcy, when a business fails, the challenge with that is if you haven't structured your wealth properly, bankruptcy spills over to your personal effects. And therefore, it's not just your business assets that often get wiped out. It's you as well as an individual, because your assets haven't been structured right. And of course, we have other social issues that, like divorce. Divorce can significantly reduce one's wealth. And I know often people don't like to talk about such things, but these are practical realities that we need to discuss and need to prepare for, because any one of these events can have a significant impact on your ability to achieve what you're trying to achieve, and effectively undermines years worth of labor. So I think these risks, as you say, they mustn't be overlooked. And peace of mind is vital in today's world. Peace of mind with regards to your money is vital. So asset protection on these catastrophic kind of risks is really, really important, because as we say, when they do happen, and it's never going to happen to me scenario, isn't it? And until it does. I mean, recently, obviously, we've had the devastating earthquakes in Turkey, which are tragic. But the fallout from that as well is going to see a lot of people lose significant amount of wealth.
Thanks for that, Rex. So now in that context, maybe we can move on and what's happening in the asset protection or in the space around the world when it comes to wealth.
Okay, I think if you could just pop up those points on the slide. I think I just wanted to touch on the concept of asset protection. What does it actually mean? What does it actually mean when we're looking at putting assets cross-border? So as a Turkish resident, you're placing funds somewhere else. So effectively, you have country A, could be Turkey, and country B, which is another country. And what you're looking to do here is you're looking to place assets from your own name, country A, across to country B, but put them into a structure in country B. And that structure needs to have its own legal personality, and it needs to be a resident in that foreign territory. The importance of that is, as this slide sort of says, the first bullet point, the laws of country A only actually apply to residents of A. They don't apply to residents of B. We all know that. The United Kingdom cannot impose its laws on a European country, and vice versa. A country's sovereignty extends only to their borders. And therefore, in terms of asset protection, moving assets from your own name into a structure where that structure is resident in another territory starts to give you a significant amount of protection. What it does, it protects you from political risk and all legislative risk that might arise in your country of residence. So if there's a claim against you, whether that's by a government or a third party, an individual or institution, if there's a claim on you that's successful in country A, but your assets are sitting in a structure which itself has a legal personality in country B, those claims cannot extend to those assets. Country A has no right or claim on those assets because those assets sit under a totally different jurisdiction with a different set of legislation. So one of the key things, now that's slightly different if you held an account in a foreign country, because that account still belongs to you. So it's still attachable. So we will look at this concept a little bit more a bit later, but if you hold a life insurance policy, a securitized instrument, stocks, shares, but they're in your own name, of course, country A can force you to bring those assets back into the country to deal with the issue. But if they're in a separate structure with its own legal personality, obviously, those are separate from you, and that can't happen. So I hope that sort of gets the idea across. I don't know if that makes sense, Attila.
Rex, that's really useful. You know what would also, especially with what we mentioned a little earlier, is now we work primarily with Guernsey. So in the context, what makes Guernsey so special as a jurisdiction historically, and as a safe jurisdiction, the qualities, attributions of, why are we choosing Guernsey? I think that's really important because most people may not be familiar with the jurisdiction.
I think one of the advantages of a place like Guernsey, it has its own laws, its own government. So it's a totally self-functioning state, in the same way that Singapore is, for example, or Switzerland is, as other offshore territories. So it isn't beholden to any other authority. It has total control over its own rules. And Guernsey as a jurisdiction also has incredibly well developed legislation and regulation. Now, one of the issues, I would say, with the majority of offshore territories that are tax neutral effectively, is that in the majority of them, the individual, once you put your money into that territory, if something goes wrong, the only recourse to you is via the courts in that country. With Guernsey, you have the ombudsman. In addition to that, you have depositor protection, investor protection, and other forms of protection that are the rights of anyone that holds an account there, whether you're a resident or not. So as a territory, it has evolved very specifically around ensuring that and safeguarding the assets of non-residents together with the residents themselves of Jersey. So you have a very well developed legal framework and an ability to get recourse should something happen that you are unhappy with. I mean, that could be down to even just poor service. You can go to the ombudsman if you aren't getting the service from your provider that you aren't, and the ombudsman ruling is the same as a court. So, but you haven't had the cost of going to the courts because the ombudsman services are free. So people often overlook that, but I mean, as a territory, it's one of the only AAA rated territories in the world, and of course, it's got long-standing history. And the other thing that I like about Guernsey, the same goes for some of the other offshore territories, is they don't have political parties. So politics doesn't really feature in the running of the island. You have a state, the members of those states are appointed directly by the public. There are no political parties.
Interesting.
So, yeah, so your regulation doesn't become a tug toy where the left and the right are pulling against each other. That simply doesn't exist. You simply have a state that's elected by the people. If you do a good job, they re-elect you the next year. If you do a bad job, they elect somebody else. To my mind, it's a far more democratic system than a political party system. But that's one of the attractions of Guernsey, and that's why it has been so stable for so many years. The same is true in the Isle of Man. The same is true in Jersey. So Guernsey is not unique, but we like Guernsey given its particularly given its trust and pension legislation. It's worthwhile to know that the Channel Islands is the second largest depository of pension funds globally, international schemes outside of Luxembourg. So, I mean, I think those numbers speak for themselves. That's where people put their trust and their faith in the system, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. So as we move along with asset protection, within the theme of asset protection, can you explain a little bit about the planning and the cross-border?
Whether you're holding your assets within the country that you live or you're going to hold them overseas, you effectively have four choices. And this is a simplification, but you effectively have four choices. You own assets in your own personal name. You have a company that has assets in it or is a trading organization of some sort. You have a trust, or you have assets that are put aside for retirement. So I think those are the four buckets that your assets will actually fall into. If you look at most people, you can put all your wealth into one of those four different options. But if we go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of these different options.
So this is actually important, just quickly, from a Turkish perspective, Rex, because most people in Turkey, the majority, will have their personal wealth in the company and their personal name. In Turkey, non-recourse debt does not exist. So automatically, when as a company you acquire leverage from a bank, for example, you are giving personal surety to that debt. So all debt has personal recourse once if the funds are under the individual's name, and that could be considered a significant risk.
Yes, I think that's right, because you can't segregate your personal and company liabilities from each other.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah, it's a big risk.
So to plan, on the planning perspective, the options that are available and the advantages, maybe you can go through them now.
Yes, certainly. So I think the first one we talk about is personal assets. Having assets in your own name is critical. You can't function without assets in your own name. The question is, how much of your wealth should you hold in your own name? That's the question. And that answer will be different for absolutely everybody, depending on your own circumstances, where you are on the journey in terms of your life stages, etc. But I think so. Personal assets, you have lots of freedom. You can choose to do what you want with them, and they are accessible. And that's the beauty of personal assets. However, all of those assets are exposed to all forms of risk. If something happens, those personal assets are absolutely attachable. As Attila just alluded to, there's no segregation in terms of liability between companies and the individual in Turkey. So your personal assets are most at risk. But as I said, you do need personal assets to function. What people often forget about, and we are talking about placing assets offshore. If I place assets in Switzerland, for example, or the US or the UK, three very commonly used territories, what people don't necessarily consider is the implications of holding assets in your personal name on death. If anyone's ever had assets in Switzerland and been a beneficiary or dependent of somebody that's passed away with such assets, they will find how difficult and how long and arduous process it is to get those assets from the Swiss account provider into the name of the person that the deceased wanted it to go to. There's an awful lot of bureaucracy, administrative process. In Switzerland, all the heirs have to agree. So that in itself can be a never-ending process. And of course, there's a certification of inheritance that has to be provided before the account provider will actually release assets. If you look at the US, for example, if you hold US assets in your personal name, yes, there's also a probate process that should go through. You should have a US will, but on passing, if you've got more than $60,000, you've got a US estate duty liability. People that hold assets in the UK, if you pass away with personal assets in the UK over 325,000, you've got a 40% UK inheritance tax liability. So people often forget, if you think about my slide at the start, you've got different countries. Every country's got its own rules. And just because you've put your assets in another country doesn't mean you're not subject to their rules. Quite the opposite. You're absolutely subject to their rules, and you're also subject to the rules in your own country. So you have to consider the implications, particularly around on death, with regards to what's going to happen to those assets. And those assets are there for a purpose. They're going to be to provide for someone else. It can be incredibly complicated. And it's at a time when the people that are left behind really are dealing with personal matters. They're dealing with grief. They're dealing with the fact that the patriarch's gone. So it is a very challenging time. The last thing they want to be doing is dealing with the complexity that results from the lack of planning. So I think that's really, really important. Company assets, I think the advantage of company assets outside of Turkey, as it sounds, is that you do have a segregation between liability. So you can segregate your liability from that of your company if you have assets in a foreign company. Again, you might have a claim against you in Turkey, but that foreign company is a separate entity in its own right. The only fly in the ointment with regards to that is generally the individual hold the shares for that company in their own name, which can drag all of that back into personal assets. So again, how those shares are held are really important. There's an awful lot of stuff on that slide. The only point to pick up on this is that the OECD and its initiative, which is on base erosion and profit shifting, which is all about taxation, continues to, I suppose, bring or limit the use of companies for planning. So and taxation will effectively be due where taxation should be due. So again, companies that were used typically in the past for tax efficiency, a lot of those efficiencies are being done away with. Turkey has signed up to what's called the multilateral instrument. It hasn't been ratified in Parliament in Turkey yet, but it will happen, and that again is going to do away with some of the tax advantages of holding offshore companies, or potentially do away with those, as we've seen happening in other countries as that instrument gets approved. So a lot of complexity with companies these days, a lot of cost in running them, and of course you can end up with those assets all back in your own name, but they do have some some tax advantages. Remember, as an individual, you're not taxed for the profits of your company. That's down to your company. So there are definitely advantages of having companies. Trusts are fantastic vehicles in my mind. I appreciate that in Turkey, trust is a foreign concept. And Turkey hasn't signed up to was not party to the Hague Convention on Trusts. Yes, Turkey is a participant in terms of international law, but it doesn't partake in that very, very critical convention, which would have meant that Turkey has to recognize trusts. So therefore, there's complexity around trusts from a Turkish perspective, which really makes them less attractive because there's just a little bit less certainty on how a foreign trust may be dealt with in the Turkish courts if it ever gets to that. And of course, the civil law system in Turkey doesn't necessarily rely on precedent. So trusts, very useful to protect assets, but there are some questions over other aspects of their use. And of course, also incredibly useful for passing on assets. All those issues we spoke about, assets held in the trust, all of those are dealt with by the trustees and makes it very, very seamless for the individual to pass assets on to beneficiaries when they pass on. I think then it sort of brings us on to pensions, which I often feel are the most overlooked. And they're overlooked because we all have this view that pensions are something that's linked to your employer, or it's something that the government does and has a state pension benefit. But pensions have moved on significantly. And I think it's important, in 2001, Turkey actually introduced the personal voluntary pension scheme. And now, pretty much globally, definitely within all the OECD countries, of course, which Turkey is part, you have three pillars to pensions. State-funded pension schemes, a lot of these are means tested these days. You're only going to get payout from the state under certain conditions, and it's really reserved for the poorest people in society. Occupational pensions, where the employer is responsible for making sure that you're looked after in retirement, depending on how long you've worked for them and who hasn't contributed. But there's also the understanding that that's not enough. You need to make provision for your later stage in life. And I think this is where people got to stop thinking about them as a pension, but rather your voluntary schemes are actually there to deal with some of those objectives we spoke about at the start. They are a safe haven to hold your assets. And remember, pensions pretty much around the world have legislation that protects those assets because they have to be there when you reach retirement. Governments don't want you to be drawing on the social security system. They want you to have a pension scheme or to have sufficient assets in retirement. So pensions are fantastic when it comes to asset protection. They probably have better asset protection than trusts. I'm sure a lot of very smart trustees out there would want to have a debate with me and tell me I'm absolutely wrong on that. But I would happily have that conversation with them. You have legislative protection, you have regulatory protection, and there's also contractual terms that provide you with protection. So bankruptcy, third-party claims, fantastic vehicles to protect assets. And of course, if you have an international pension scheme, you've got a structure that doesn't sit obviously within Turkey. So you also do not have any, you mitigate those other sort of legal claims that might arise should something untoward happen with your affairs in your home country. So pensions, another nice thing about pensions, they are very simple. Turkey understands pensions. Again, OECD member, Turkey's double tax treaty arrangements all have Article 18 in them, which deals with pensions. So pensions are understood. They are not trusts. They're not companies. They're not personal assets. And this sort of, I suppose, delimitation with regards to the different silos of assets. As I said, this is a sort of a common standard around the world, and you'll have legislation typically that supports these different pillars. As we said, Turkey doesn't have a pillar to support trusts, and therefore questionable. Although they may be a very good use for trusts for people that are from Turkey. There might be a very good use of those. So I think if I sort of boil that down, Attila, and we come down to the need to protect and preserve assets, pensions, in my mind, are probably one of the most suitable choices. And the reason for that is they're simple. They are very, very cost effective, particularly when compared to trusts and company structures. And governments around the world understand them. They know what they are. They know what they're intended to do. and they all treat them in a very similar way, not necessarily the same, but a very similar way. So my starting point, if I was advising a client, is look at your personal assets, see what it is you need in your personal assets to function, and then if you're looking to protect and preserve assets or have accumulated a lot of wealth or have wealth sitting in other territories which are in your personal name but are intended for use at a later stage, definitely look at consolidating those into a pension, because you'll mitigate a significant number of the risks. Then comes the potential of a company and the potential of a trust, depending on your level of wealth.
Rex, thanks for that. That was very encompassing. As you were chatting, a couple of things maybe we can briefly go over came to mind. In my meetings in Turkey, I've come across 3 structures, let's say, that I've come across, and I can argue 2 of them are put forward as quick solutions by Swiss banks, in my humble opinion. One of them is an AMC, which an AMC acts almost like a fund for an individual where you put your assets, and as a tax solution, let's say. A second is, again, within the Swiss banking environment, where you see the investment companies. And thirdly, something that we, from our experience, are a little bit cautious on, because as you say, in England, what was it? The something's in the pudding. I can't think of it now. But the detail is, and that's insurance policies, because they seem very simple and straightforward. So maybe just very briefly, if you could just comment on those 3 in perspective.
I've got AMCs, insurance policies. What was the middle one? Sorry, Attila.
There's Swiss investment companies, which are actually quite expensive, where individuals put their assets into an investment company.
Okay, fine. Okay. I think I'll start off by saying these vehicles, all these products, probably all have a role to play in someone's financial planning, or potentially have a role to play in their financial planning. It's just you have to consider in which of these different silos they may sit. So if I take an AMC, and the other point I'd also like to just make here is that when planning, you shouldn't let the tax tail wag the financial planning dog. Yeah, if you try and lead your financial planning by way of tax planning, I can tell you now, you will come unstuck. Why?
Very good point.
Because tax laws change every year. So spending a whole lot of money to put a structure in place that can simply be changed by a stroke of a pen next year does not make sense. Of course, tax is a critical consideration because it's a cost. Yeah, it's a cost. And if you can mitigate that cost legitimately by using a structure that's taxed in a certain way, that's an advantage. Yeah, and of course, everyone's able to organize their affairs in an appropriate way. But just be careful that you're missing the point, which is preserving and protecting your wealth in order to mitigate a tax. Which is, yes, it's an erosive threat. It's a persistent eroser of wealth, but it's not a catastrophe issue. Get it all wrong, and you might find it becomes a catastrophe issue when the tax authority has a different view to you on your affairs over the last 10 years. So that was my first point. If we just deal quickly with, appreciate time, AMCs are effectively a contract that turns your portfolio of stocks and shares into a contract. It is tax efficient. There's no tax on what's happening inside. There's only tax when you cash in or take a portion of that the funds out of that contract. So they are very, very useful. The problem with these things is they're a personal asset. They're held in your own name. So again, there's none of that asset protection that's in place. Yes, you could probably hold it in a company, but the other issue is balance sheet risk. What you've done is you've parted with money, and you've got the securitized arrangement. But there's going to be balance sheet risk there. you've given something away for something. There is going to be creditor risk, balance sheet risk there. I'm not that familiar with the ins and outs of those, but there will be balance sheet risk. You know, I talked a bit earlier about Lehman's and the Icelandic banks, and of course we've got the American banks, and we know what's happening in Switzerland. So you will have risk there. Offshore companies or investment companies, again, they achieve a very similar outcome to the AMC in that they will the investment gains and the growth within these companies, particularly if you pop them in a tax neutral territory, is not taxed. So that's really useful. You're not going to have any taxation, which means your assets can grow free of tax. We have mitigated one of those erosive threats. But again, often those shares are held in your own name. That could create a problem. Aren't those shares better off held in possibly a pension structure, or actually in a company, maybe a trust? I'm not an expert on trust when it comes to Turkey, so maybe a trust. So I think how you hold that vehicle is important. Going back to that first slide, when I talk about costs, if you are going to put those that investment company into hold the shares of that investment company in another company or a pension scheme, then you've got to actually sit down and do the maths to see if it makes sense. I've seen some fantastic planning, but when you look at the cost of the planning and the ongoing costs, it makes no sense at all. It doesn't make any sense at all. So feasibility is really important. What's the cost of setting up the company, maintaining the company, getting the accounts done, the taxation of the company, the returns of the company? What are you paying for all that versus what are you getting? Now, there's two sides of things in terms of what are you getting. There's the fiscal benefit of maybe some tax efficiency. Yeah, there's maybe some administrative benefit. But again, what's the actual value you're getting from it, Attila? Life policies, they're very useful life policies. In that they are relatively tax efficient. Similar to the company in the AMC, they give you that tax-free roll-up environment. They're also very useful in that when you pass away, the assets go straight to your beneficiaries. Yeah, so in terms of owning assets in your personal name, very complex, time-consuming. These life policies, the money goes to your beneficiaries, which is great. So you've had that succession of wealth go across, and the life company will typically deal with taxation if there is any taxation at that point. The beneficiary might have some tax to pay, and indeed the life policy itself will always be an asset in your name, because the life policy is taken out in your name, and therefore you also obviously have to consider death duties, wealth taxes if they apply in your country of residence. So if you have any taxes that arise on death, those will obviously take into account the policy. Even though the policy is paid out, your state will have to deal with those taxes. But as I said, they are very useful. The downside with life insurance contracts, in my mind, or a consideration with regards to them, is how they actually work. I have money. Let's say the life insurance company, Attila. I have money. I give you that money. In exchange for that money, you give, it's a premium. In exchange for that premium, you give me a policy. A policy is a contract. Yeah, and there's rights attached to that contract. The money that I have handed over to you is in exchange for that contract. That money is now yours. Yeah. Now, I know within these contracts, there's a bundle of assets that people invest in, but those assets are not the policyholders. Policyholders like to think it belongs to them. It doesn't. They just have the contractual rights associated to the policy. The money belongs to the life insurance company, and it sits on the balance sheet of the life insurance company. If that life insurance company goes bang, that's their money. So you carry credit risk. I appreciate that if it's an EU territory that's issuing these life insurance policies, there's a lot of protection that's been put in place to protect clients from that risk. The question is, do you want to be involved in that risk at all? Is it necessary to be involved in that risk? Are there not simpler ways to hold your assets to achieve the same outcome? Interestingly enough, all of those three structures, particularly companies and the life insurance side of things, very, very useful in terms of the succession bit. AMCs less so, but they're all relatively tax efficient. Different levels of credit risk, different levels of balance sheet risk associated with those. And of course, also
one question, quickly, one question. With an insurance policy then, if I die, does the beneficiary receive the assets in the
policy?
In the policy, or do they receive a payout, cash in cash form?
The devil's in the detail, as they say, Attila. So it really comes down to the contractual terms of the policy. Most life companies, and not all, but most life companies, their contractual obligation is to make a cash payment to the value of the assets on the death of the member. Now, that can be problematic. Now, if you're in a pension scheme, you don't have those conditions. The pension scheme, you pass away, the pension scheme's there, it's now got to look after somebody else. The downside can be is your chart that you put up earlier. You happen to die right when the dot-com bubble burst. You happen to pass
just
away.
Think of 2022. I mean, it's compared to 2021. So
yeah. If you died in 2022, the asset values were what, 23%, 24% down from the previous year. It crystallizes that loss and passes it across. So because that's the contractual obligation on the life company, that's the terms. You've passed away, the policy gets cashed in, the assets get sold, and the cash goes to the beneficiaries. And often there's more than one beneficiary. So actually trying to divvy up assets becomes incredibly difficult. But it comes down to the contractual terms. Most of the terms, the life company has an obligation to cash that in on your death. And therefore, market timing, who knows? Who knows what the markets are going to be doing when you pass away? I appreciate you should also, and this is something that we don't do, you do, how you structure your assets and how you invest and the risk you take from an investment point of view is very important depending on your stage of life. So that might help reduce that risk, but it's not going to mitigate it fully.
Yeah. So thank you for that. So maybe we can slowly wrap up because we're out of time. And Rex and I were talking yesterday on the presentation and how we should finish. And we had some, these are concluding thoughts that we can go through, advantages. But then try to think of it in one word and to put context to one's wealth. And we discussed it and we thought really what it's about is legacy and creating and securing that financial legacy. Wealth is no longer something about a personal life, especially when you accumulate wealth. It could be, have to consider a person's wife, person's husband, children, extended family, and securing that multi-generational financial legacy. It's probably the most important thing one leaves behind. And I would guess primarily that is what we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah.
So,
and Rex, I thought that, Ella, just to tell a last thought on that as you were talking, which is, in order to leave a legacy, it's vitally important to have created that safe haven for your wealth so it can actually be left. And the amount of peace of mind that I see clients have or getting from putting in place the safe haven, knowing that if the catastrophe event happens, when the dust settles, those funds are still there. They can still leave the legacy, which might be a living legacy for themselves, or indeed the legacy for the next generation.